Burning liquid drips through the turret ring gaps. It hits the crew directly. The hardest part wasn't taking an anti-tank shell. It was trying to squeeze out when the floor beneath you caught fire. Archive photos show the grim reality. Dead men dangling halfway out the sides. The Panzer IV had dedicated side hatches for the gunner and loader. Early Shermans forced 3 guys through a single hole. But German ergonomics became a death trap. A standard hatch was barely 40 centimeters wide. Try pushing your way through that wearing heavy winter gear. Urban combat brought Molotov cocktails and satchel charges. These tanks were never watertight. The gunner shoves the side door open. He scrambles out. He gets stuck at the waist. Flames lick his boots. The stench of burning wool uniform mixes with raw fuel. He kicks frantically. He goes nowhere. The fire just climbs higher. Soviet infantry took massive losses from these machines, but they watched the crews burn. They understood the deal. No worse fate. The Sherman went down in history as a rolling lighter, though the Panzer IV actually burned about 8 times more often. This inferno inside the hull did not come from ruptured fuel lines. It came from the 87 main gun shells scattered everywhere. You must look closely at the physics of a shaped charge impact to understand this trap. When a warhead struck the side armor, it initiated a terrifying chemical reaction. The sharp whistle of a pressurized molten copper jet piercing steel was the last thing heard. That high-velocity stream punched right through the thin plates, spraying liquid metal directly across the fighting compartment. It immediately found those brass casings stacked dangerously close to the crew. You are looking at roughly 70 kilograms of raw propellant packed tight around the men. Once that copper jet touched the powder, a catastrophic chain reaction was guaranteed. The resulting flash fire consumed the oxygen instantly, turning a cramped metal box into a blast furnace. Allied engineers eventually tackled this exact problem by introducing wet stowage systems for their medium tanks. That simple modification pushed the Sherman fire probability down to a manageable 10 to 15%. The Germans simply ignored the flaw entirely. They left the Panzer IV with an 80% chance of catching fire after a penetrating hit. That fatal ammunition layout received 0 protective upgrades until the final day of the war. 152mm shell. That single projectile redefined the meaning of destruction. Soviet heavy assault guns like the Su and ISU fired these massive rounds. The kinetic energy of that high explosive impact was simply staggering. It bypassed armor entirely. The sheer blunt force could rip the entire turret straight off its mounting ring. The internal shockwave instantly liquefied the 5 men inside. No open casket funeral followed. It was a complete slaughter. Western Allied forces brought their own flavor of misery. They fired solid steel shots. These rounds lacked the explosive filler of German shells, but they still effortlessly punched through and ignited those vulnerable ammo racks. And if it was not a bazooka, a 13mm bullet bounced inside the steel box. Big artillery was not the only fatal threat. The Red Army deployed massive numbers of anti-tank rifles. They systematically exploited the dangerously thin side plates. Close-range urban combat turned these rifles into execution tools. Infantry aimed down from elevated windows. They shot directly through the thin roof. Once that tiny, armor-piercing round penetrated, the real horror began. It violently ricocheted around the enclosed fighting compartment. The projectile bounced off the inner walls repeatedly. It essentially turned the interior into a high-speed meat grinder. This thin shell offered virtually 0 protection against Eastern Front reality. Every single enemy weapon punched through it. The crews quickly learned to fear those infantry rifles. Their frustration with the vulnerable design pushed them to adapt. They realized the factory was not going to save them, so they took matters into their own hands. Tankers scrounged for any extra metal they could find. Crews bolted these Scherzen screens to the sides and turrets. Desperate soldiers welded these heavy shields directly in the field. Where did this paper-thin armor originate? This death trap avoided tank duels. Designers drafted it in 1934. They hid it from Versailles inspectors. The The project required strict secrecy. Engineers called it a medium tractor. That designation was a deliberate lie. It was an accompanying support vehicle. Look at the internal mechanics. 5 men squeezed inside the hull. They were artillerymen, not actual tankers. They fired a short 75mm howitzer. The crew layout was highly modern. Commander sat elevated in the rear. He spotted targets from the top. Gunner and loader flanked the breech. Driver took the front left hatch. He steered with mechanical brake levers. Radio operator manned the right side. Communication flowed perfectly between these men. They operated as one unified team, but they were incredibly soft targets. The defense numbers reveal the truth. Armor ranged from 8 to 16 millimeters. 16 millimeters is absolutely pathetic. It equals a modern smartphone thickness. This steel stopped only rifle bullets. Nothing bigger, no heavy shrapnel, no direct hits. It was a mobile glass cannon. German doctrine dictated clear combat roles. Lighter models hunted enemy armor threats. This machine blew up infantry bunkers. It lobbed heavy, high-explosive shells. The thin armor matched this doctrine. It shielded against basic infantry fire. Engineers never anticipated heavy incoming hits. The original concept created a trap. Designers prioritized pure offensive firepower. They sacrificed vital crew protection completely. Those thin plates saved crucial weight. Less weight meant better cross-country mobility. Everything worked for a support role. But war changes rules very quickly. Enemies deployed massive anti-tank cannons everywhere. This machine stood completely naked there. The military kept demanding more units. Factories kept stamping thin steel plates. The 8mm roof stopped nothing. The 16mm front bent easily. Side plates shattered under basic impacts. Spalling fragments filled the crew compartment. The original design doomed these soldiers. 5 artillerymen found themselves completely exposed inside a fragile metal box that would soon face weapons capable of tearing it apart. Picture a young driver gripping the steering levers. He stares blankly at endless Polish dirt roads for 3 whole days without sleeping a single wink. The rhythmic metallic clank of steel tracks grinding forward for 72 hours non-stop temporarily masks the severe structural flaws. The theory sounded perfect. On September 1, 1939, the German military rolled out slightly over 200 Panzer IVs to test their blitzkrieg tactics. That initial battlefield exposure finally brought those miserable 16 millimeters of steel armor face to face with harsh reality. It was their very first real test. Things did not go according to plan. The famous lightning war concept quickly started showing massive cracks when tanks actually took enemy fire. Standard anti-tank rifles and small-caliber field guns easily punched right through the thin hull. This simply turned the cramped interior into a deadly trap for the exhausted men inside. Out of the relatively small fleet involved in this initial push, enemy fire knocked out 76 different vehicles. 19 of those damaged machines were completely destroyed. They burned out utterly beyond any hope of factory repair. Losing roughly 1/3 of their heavy support force in a single swift campaign terrified the crews. The reality was grim. This heavy toll immediately prompted surviving frontline tankers to start filing urgent field requests. They practically begged their high command to bolt extra armor plates onto the vulnerable hulls. What do you do with an infantry support tank? You use it against armor it cannot pierce. June 1941 finally arrived. Operation Barbarossa officially began. 400 Panzer IVs rolled east. Command expected a swift summer victory. They brought a knife to a gunfight. The shock came incredibly fast. The enemy deployed heavy T-34s. They unleashed the massive KV-1. Systemic panic spread through German ranks. Nobody expected this. Frontal armor reached 90 millimeters. The short German gun just bounced off. It was useless. The battlefield environment changed forever. 37mm guns failed miserably. 50mm shells shattered on impact. Nothing penetrated the thick Soviet steel. The original design became obsolete overnight. Crews faced reality. Their machines were simple death traps. Fear reached the high command. No turning back. Generals demanded an immediate structural solution. The old blitzkrieg tactics completely failed. You cannot outflank heavy steel walls. Every single engagement ended in disaster. The short barrel offered zero advantage. The basic hull faced early retirement. Command lost all previous blind confidence. They needed real answers right now. Berlin finally understood the massive flaw. Headquarters panicked. The situation required a desperate fix. They dispatched a special commission straight to the Eastern Front to study this terrifying armor crisis. Before, these crews spent their days lobbing high-explosive shells at static concrete bunkers. Now, they had to somehow hunt down actual enemy tanks. The immediate engineering response was essentially an act of panic, shoving a heavy anti-tank weapon into a chassis built exclusively for infantry support. It created a terrifying contrast, pairing a seriously lethal gun with an essentially cardboard hull. When the fighting moved to the sweeping deserts of North Africa, American tanks like the M3 Lee and the Sherman proved too tough for standard German armor. The dedicated tank killer of the time, the Panzer IV, had already hit its physical upgrade ceiling. Its smaller turret ring simply could not handle anything heavier than a 50mm gun, rendering it increasingly useless as the conflict dragged on. This forced the Panzer IV to completely abandon its original support role and undergo a rather violent mechanical mutation. Because the Panzer IV possessed a noticeably larger turret ring, engineers realized it could physically fit a much larger weapon. They selected the 75mm Pak-40, a heavy-towed anti-tank gun that they hastily modified for armored use. But forcing this high-velocity weapon into a support vehicle created serious structural complications. The violent recoil of the new gun placed a colossal strain on a turret ring that designers had originally calculated for a low-velocity, short-barreled howitzer. The machine became profoundly unbalanced, both mechanically and tactically. While the new weapon could reliably punch through Allied armor, the crews operating it remained trapped inside an underprotected box. If hit by almost anything heavier than a basic machine gun, their armor simply failed to stop the incoming kinetic energy. Internal spalling would tear through the fighting compartment, mangling the crew even if a fire somehow failed to start. They suffered terrible breakdown rates across the harsh desert terrain, eventually facing massive numerical superiority from the incoming American forces. As defeat loomed over the North African campaign, desperate crews had to systematically destroy their own surviving vehicles. You would hear the hollow thud of heavy rocks being hammered directly into the long steel barrels of their powerful guns. Retreating soldiers would then load a live shell into the breech and yank the firing lanyard from a safe distance. The resulting internal explosion would completely rupture the compromised steel tube, violently tearing the weapon apart. Who formed the main armored backbone during those massive historical battles? Just an old infantry support vehicle? Nazi propaganda praised those invincible heavy tigers. The historical reality was much darker. Germany built under 1,400 Tigers. They were incredibly rare machines, a mere statistical error overall. The real tank crews burned inside Panzer IVs. Thousands died horribly. These deeply flawed machines carried the late war entirely. They fought brutally at the Kursk salient. The tank combat was pure savagery. Thick metal ground violently against metal. Their German combat losses were staggering. They killed many enemy tanks, but their foes evolved fast. The famous T-34 was heavily upgraded. It got an 85mm gun. Panzer crews faced a total nightmare. Survival became impossible. Then Normandy happened. The bloody slaughter shifted west. Allied armor flooded the open French fields. Shermans pushed forward. American tank destroyers hunted them down everywhere. British Fireflies pierced their thin shells easily. Certain death also came from above. The European skies were never clear. Allied fighter bombers hunted them constantly. Planes unleashed deadly barrages of rockets. Nowhere was safe. The East brought worse nightmares. Heavy Soviet armor finally arrived. They rolled menacingly over the horizon. The IS-2 changed everything forever. It ended there. Their steel frames shattered completely under the crushing kinetic impact of a massive new Soviet weapon measuring exactly 122 millimeters. Allied infantry crouched in the dirt, listening. A mile away, an ear-piercing shriek echoed across the valley. Bare steel grinding directly against bare steel. By 1944, this machine began falling apart physically before it even reached the front line. Germany ran out of rubber. Factories stopped putting rubber tires on the road wheels. When these raw metal rims hit the metal tracks, the resulting screech deafened the crews. It alerted every enemy patrol in the sector. You could not hide a late-war Panzer IV. The biggest crisis involved basic chemistry. The Reich lost its manganese sources after the Soviet Army recaptured the Nikopol mining basin. Without manganese, armor steel loses its viscosity. It becomes brittle. When an enemy shell struck this late-war armor, the metal did not bend. It cracked like cheap glass. A non-penetrating hit instantly turned the interior wall into a shotgun blast. Razor-sharp steel fragments ripped through the tight crew compartment. The armor held, but the men inside died. Inside the assembly halls, under constant 8th Air Force bombing rates, the tank devolved. A factory worker skipped the final paint job. He left the interior coated in dark red oxide primer instead of the standard bright ivory white. The men inside could barely see their own equipment in the gloom. Next down the line, another worker installed a simple hand crank. The electric turret traverse motors were gone entirely. The Aus J variant was not a modern upgrade. It was a stripped-down, desperate mutation. Even the human element degraded. Armored training collapsed from 16 weeks down to just 4. Boys went into combat barely knowing how to load the main gun. Meanwhile, the production line harbored a quiet war. Captive laborers worked in the shadows of the factories. They dropped loose bolts and metal nuts deep into the fuel lines. Engines starved and died on the way to the battlefield. Yet the factories kept turning. They built over 8,000 units in total.